Hello guys, welcome back to another installment of the Mountainside Apologetics Series. We're drawing this thing to a close here pretty soon, and wanted to make sure and hit this topic today, a topic that I think is the biggest issue facing Christian apologetics today. If you talk with most apologists, most philosophers, they will point to this as the big issue, the toughest thing to respond to as an opposition to the Christian worldview. That is the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, unjust suffering, natural evil, the pains and hurts that we feel in this world. And just in this picture, you've got a guy walking across a bunch of rubble. It looks like a tornado would probably ravage that neighborhood. Nobody asked for that. They weren't particularly evil that would happen, yet their lives are thrown into shambles. And the expression on his face kind of says it, just looking down at the rubble, and how many people feel that at some point during their life when they just look down and they think that all they see is rubble, when what's supposed to be standing there is a house, is their shelter, is their livelihood. And then it's taken. One way or another. It doesn't have to be a tornado. It's often sickness. It's often deaths of family members, deaths of loved ones. Sometimes it's financial. Sometimes it's your own personal health. And this is powerful on an emotional level, and it's also powerful on a logical and philosophical level. That's why Christians continue to take this issue very seriously in Christian apologetics, both from an emotional standpoint and a logical standpoint. And of course, the way you approach this issue is much different depending on whether you're just talking with somebody who recently lost a family member, or if you're talking with a philosophy student about the possibility of God's existence. Okay, those are two very different things. And I think that what you find is that these emotionally gut-wrenching events, these intense events are pivotal. They will turn to God, and God will restore their hearts toward Him, or they will turn away from God. They will not sense His presence, and they will refer back to that intense emotional event where God supposedly did not intervene for them. And they will look at that as a reason to say, for years forward, that God does not exist. And I've encountered this on the campus at UNM and other places. And usually people there are pretty removed from the emotional intensity of the evil and suffering that's taking place in their life, but they still look at it as a reason to think that God does not exist. If God exists, these things that I see on the news, these things that happen to family members or to friends, they wouldn't happen. God would make sure that they don't go through that kind of pain. And since they do, it looks like either God doesn't care or God does not exist, and we think that if God does exist, He cares. So given the pain that some people or I myself have to deal with, seems more reasonable to think that God does not exist. This is the problem of evil. And this is hard to face, especially when somebody is going through it in the moment. And all we can do here is take a logical approach to it. And that's what we're going to do. A logical approach is this solid foundation where the emotions can come and go like a roller coaster. When the emotions settle, there's still the strong structure of the logical foundation. But let's keep pressing the difficulty of this issue. Stephen Fry said, "The God who made this universe, if it was created by God, is quite clearly a maniac." And I'm not sure what exactly Stephen Fry is referring to there. I suspect it may be something related to the animal kingdom, where you see animals tearing other animals apart. Is God the beautiful designer of the things that are ravaging the animal kingdom? The problem of evil is a real reason that people say they don't believe in God. I've heard it myself from people. It's the most common, like I've said. And often you can draw it back to this idea. They may give other reasons for why they think God doesn't exist. Often it comes down to an emotional occurrence where they think God didn't step in. Here's Frederick. If God's the only creator, why did He create evil, and how could He do that if He is good? He says, quote, "The concept of God is logically inconsistent. How can anything imperfect come from a perfect God? How can there be evil in the world if God is good? Who created evil? If God is the only creator, why did he create evil? And how could he do that if he is good? How can God have a nature at all if he's omnipotent?" He's trying to expose the contradictory nature of God, and it seems contradictory to him that evil would exist if God alone is the all-powerful and good being. From the same site, Barry says, quote, "It is also blindingly obvious that every depiction of God that is actually worshipped by anybody is riddled with logical inconsistencies. How can God be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving if he permits massive suffering throughout the entire universe, and not just suffering caused by man's free will?" I will revisit that in a moment. So what a lot of this problem of evil draws back to is a Greek philosopher named Epicurus. And he is quoted as saying this, but I suspect that through translation and kind of manipulating it to be more Americanized, we have the form that it is now. Here's what he's cited as saying: "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent, or mean, a bully, bad. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil, or where does evil come from? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God?" Break it down into 4 points here, and we'll develop some premises that we can examine. So, God wants to but can't. Okay, such a being's not omnipotent. God can but doesn't want to. If he doesn't want to get rid of evil, then he's not good. Of course, God is good according to the Christian worldview and every other type of monotheism. God can and wants to. Well, if that's the case, then there should be no evil. God can't and doesn't want to. That doesn't sound like God at all. Now, atheists will take this to a far different conclusion than what I believe Epicurus was trying to state. Epicurus is just trying to say God or gods, since Greece was a polytheistic culture, and evil are in tension. There seems to be a tension between God and evil. And then he seems to be as an assumption that God and evil both exist, and therefore there's this mystery to be resolved. It's not necessarily a rhetorical question. It's not necessarily an argument for atheism in Epicurus's view, but it's a mystery to be resolved. How can we probe deeper in our philosophy to answer this well, I think is what he would be saying. But the atheists will take this to their desired conclusion, and they will take as a premise that God and evil cannot coexist. There's a dichotomy. Either God exists or evil exists. And they take as a premise that evil exists. Look out at the world. Unjust, suffering, and evil exist. Therefore, God does not exist. Okay, it's actually valid logic. It's not necessarily the conclusion that Epicurus would draw, I don't think. And then on the Christian side, there's a different conclusion that follows, kind of a different assumption. Christians take as a given that God exists. They take as a given that evil exists. And rather than seeing that as an impossible relationship, they say, well, simply God and evil can coexist. Why think that they can't? Well, it would just take some rethinking about the place of evil in this world. So, thinking back on the atheist conclusion that God does not exist because only evil or God can exist, we have 2 different approaches that we can take to this problem of evil. There is the offensive approach. So that's where you turn the problem back on the skeptic, make it backfire. And we'll do that the latter parts of this lesson. And there's the defensive approach. You resolve the logic. The airtight logical formulation of this is often referred to as the logical problem of evil, whereas the other would be called the probabilistic problem of evil. The probabilistic problem of evil would be that there is so much evil and suffering that it seems more likely that God does not exist. The logical problem of evil would be that God and evil cannot coexist, therefore, definitive conclusion, God does not exist. And this means, for our Christian defense, we just resolve the logic and show that the conclusion does not necessarily follow from the premises. It follows from the premises that we just looked at, that God and evil cannot coexist, but we would have to show that one of those premises is not necessarily true. And we can also show that the unbeliever, the atheist, is not in a proper place where they can judge the likelihood of God's existence based on this. They cannot really judge whether or not God would allow evil. So those are the two approaches, and we will apply this to the basic premises from what the Greek philosopher Epicurus said. He said, God is all good, God is all powerful, evil exists. It would seem that no such God could exist if evil exists. So you have to deny something out of these three in order to satisfactorily resolve the logic according to how we usually think of this problem. And this draws back to a one semester course that I had on this problem of evil. We worked through different thinkers who would deny one or maybe multiple of these premises. So the first possibility is you could deny that God is all good, but I can't really think of any legitimate Christian philosophers that deny God's goodness. You would have to go into a kind of finite God view. But God is typically defined as that being who has all the great making properties. Maybe a Leibniz or an Anselm kind of definition of God. God's the greatest conceivable being, the greatest of all beings. Every great making property that makes a thing good and great is what makes up God. There is no defect in his character, and I don't think any Christian really denies this. It comes up in the emotional problem sometimes. Maybe God had a lapse in judgment, and I'm the victim of it. But from a theological standpoint, we don't get a lot of room with God, with denying that God is all good. So we'll pass over that one, move on to God is all powerful. Okay? Can you deny this premise? Well, there are some ways to do this, and this is actually probably the most popular way to resolve the problem of evil. And there's three basic ways you can go about this, or three that I'll address. Free will, kenosis, and open theism. Now, free will is the common way to address this. Kenosis, open theism may be a little more unfamiliar to you. We'll bring up some quotes about each of these. A free will problem, probably the simplest way to resolve it, and just say evil exists because God gave man free will and man goes and does evil things. But it extends beyond this too. How far does the free will of man extend? Was man the agent that brought evil into all of creation so that now a praying mantis will bite the head off another praying mantis? Is man responsible for the natural evils? The tornado that ravages that neighborhood? Was there something about the wickedness of man that brought that about, so that free will is completely responsible for all forms of suffering and evil? Well, Boyd says in Letters from a Skeptic, page 23, why doesn't God intervene every time a person is going to misuse his freedom? A freedom that was prevented from being exercised whenever it was going to be misused simply wouldn't be freedom. And here he's going back and forth with his dad. His dad is a skeptic. He's presenting these kind of atheistic arguments. And his dad would say, seems like God ought to intervene and make sure that evil doesn't happen. If a good God exists, he would make sure that that person doesn't get murdered, right? And Boyd says, how far do we take this? Now, Boyd will say more on open theism, but for the free will case here, he says that God just can't intervene every time a person's going to misuse that freedom. Freedom is the rule. It's a given. How you use it is up to you. And Boyd goes on, if God really gives us freedom, it must be, at least to a large extent, irrevocable. He must have, within limits, a hands-off attitude toward it. God creates free people who can do as they please. So God made it as a given that man would have free will. And we'll learn some more of the implications of this in a moment. So free will is the cause for evil. God takes his hands off and allows people to create evil in their world. Now, kenosis may be an unfamiliar term to you. This is from Philippians 2. It says, Jesus Christ emptied himself. He gave up the rights of deity when he came to earth. This is a kenosis, an emptying, a divine humbling. And so kenosis, as it relates to the problem of evil, would be that God intentionally restricts his power in order to allow another of his attributes to reign. And according to Thomas J. Ord, this attribute is love. Ord wrote a book called The Uncontrolling Love of God, which may remind you of a song nowadays, The Reckless Love of God. But the uncontrolling love of God is that God is so operative in his love that God does not control people. It is his love that allows these freedoms. So this kenosis theory informs the free will theory. Now, why does God give man free will? Because he loves them. Because he has restricted himself to allow man to operate freely. And this is the context in which love between man and God takes place. And it's the context in which love between humans takes place. It's not a forced love. Now, here's some quotes from Ord. He says, I believe it is impossible to worship wholeheartedly a God who loves half-heartedly. And Ord would go on to say that the love of God is the supreme attribute of God. Every other attribute is beneath his love, is operative through his love. Ord says God cannot not love. He even said that God doesn't choose the attributes that he has. And this love operates and dictates what God does and who he is, more than anything else. All right, Ord goes on. Why doesn't a loving and powerful God prevent genuine evil? The essential kenosis model of providence offers one principal answer, although it includes various dimensions. Let me state this answer simply. God cannot unilaterally prevent genuine evil. It's not just that he wills not to, it's that he cannot. He cannot prevent genuine evil because he cannot intervene in that way with people because his love forbids him from intervening in that way. It's a kenosis, it's an emptying of the rights that God would have to do because he is so operative in that love. Finally, he says God must give and cannot take away free will. He must give and cannot take away free will. He is completely controlled by his love. This gives free will. God cannot not love, so he cannot take back that will, even if that free will is causing bad things to happen. It's kenosis, the emptying of God because he is so controlled by his love. What do you think of that? Interesting, huh? And then there's open theism. Back to Greg Boyd in this one. He's probably the most notable proponent of open theism. And open theism is a perspective on God's relationship with time, the scope of his power and his knowledge. You would have Calvinism that would say God's outside of time, has complete foreknowledge and complete control over everything that happens. You'd have Molinism that would be like this middle knowledge position that God specifically chooses which worlds will take place to bring about his greatest idea of good. And then you have open theism that God is progressing through time with us, does not have complete divine foreknowledge, and does not have complete power over future events or power over the free actions of man. Now, he's gotten a lot of criticism for this view, but let's consider it as it relates to this problem of evil. Can we deny that God is all-powerful? Well, open theism does. And Boyd says that God himself risks a great deal in creating the world. He has suffered from the ill choices of human beings, and he suffers because he loves. Now, there is a lot of satisfaction in open theism as it relates to the problem of evil because it makes God not responsible for any of the evil that takes place, but it also presents God as a very present being in that evil, that he suffers with you. It took him by surprise too. It breaks his heart too. He actually does call it evil. He just couldn't do anything about it. Yet, this creation, Boyd would say, was worth the risk because of what God would get from free human beings. Boyd goes on in Letters from a Skeptic to assume that God knows ahead of time how every person is going to freely act, assumes that each person's free activity is already there to know, but it's not. God can't foreknow the good or bad decisions of the people he creates until he creates these people and they in turn create their decisions. So free will is actually free will. It's not some way that God made you that determined that you would make those choices. It's actually free, implying that God doesn't know in advance. It's up to you to choose. It's not deterministic by the way you're created. So it limits God's knowledge especially, and to an extent his power, although open theists will still say that God is all-powerful, but this power is different than maybe what other Christian theists would say. This power is limited. This all-powerful is a less broad scope of all-powerful than what a Calvinist would say, for sure. So that's one premise that Christians may try to deny in resolving the problem of evil. God's not necessarily all-powerful. He's allowed humans to be free. He's compelled by his love. And he does not control the future or the decisions of people. Now, another premise that could be denied, and you may be surprised to hear that you can deny this premise, you could deny that evil exists. And this actually isn't denying that evil exists. It's more saying that what we call evil is not really what we think of as evil when you look on it on God's economy. And again, I'll present three ways that you can deny that evil exists. There's a Calvinistic model, a greater good model, and a privation model. And these three are going to kind of interact and overlap a little bit, and it should actually contribute pretty greatly to how we think about this problem of evil. Now, John Piper, very Calvinist, he says that the reason he takes this position is Proverbs 16:33, very simply. The lot is cast into the lap, means you may roll the dice, but its every decision is from the Lord. So there's not a chance occurrence. And you can apply that to a greater scope and say there's not a chance occurrence in anything that's going on with you. It's all from the Lord. It's all in the will of God. Does that sound too extreme? Well, it gets even more extreme. Let's go to R.C. Sproul, the late R.C. Sproul, died just a few years ago. In Chosen by God, he said, if there is one single molecule in this universe running around loose, totally free of God's sovereignty, then we have no guarantee that a single promise of God will ever be fulfilled. Does that sound like it follows? Well, if he doesn't have control over one single molecule or in one single area, isn't there a chance that that single area comes and intrudes and potentially manipulates every other area? So he's saying if God is not in total control, it could be that no promises are really under his control. Almost wants to put it as an either-or sort of proposition. If we can really trust the promises and the foreknowledge and foresight of God, it must be that God is in control over every single molecule. Nothing is stray and apart from his sovereign will. Now, how might this relate into the problem of evil? Well, on a theologyintention.com, Edwin Palmer here says that all things that happen in all the world at any time and in all history, whether inorganic matter, vegetation, animal, man or angels, both good and evil ones, come to pass because God ordained them. Even sin, the fall of the devil from heaven, the fall of Adam, and every evil thought, word, and deed in all of history. Foreordination means God's sovereign plan, whereby he decides all that is to happen in the entire universe. Nothing in this world happens by chance. Even sin. God has included them in his sovereign decree. Nothing happens by chance. Not even sin. Not even what we may call wrong is actually outside of God's sovereign working hand. He's controlling all of it. Now let's drag that out even more toward its logical conclusion. Gordon Clark is not afraid to do so. Most Calvinists are pretty afraid to draw it to this conclusion, but Gordon Clark goes there and he says, I wish very frankly and pointedly to assert that if a man gets drunk and shoots his family, it was the will of God that he should do it. Let it be unequivocally said that this view certainly makes God the cause of sin. Whoa, okay. Now we start to get a little uncomfortable. We're real comfortable with the idea that God's sovereign control is over everything. We'll have a hard time saying that God's sovereign control was over that guy who got drunk and shot his family. Gordon Clark goes there. He says, no, if it happened, it was the will of God. Otherwise, you're saying that God's not in complete sovereign control. Now we have this Calvinistic tension at work, right? Well, how might the free will that we addressed earlier come into play with this? And how would this inform our idea of free will? Free will wouldn't really be free. It would be God's complete control. It would feel free to us. So, what could we call evil then? Well, we're only calling things evil by our own perspective, by how we feel toward it, but in reality, when it's under God's sovereign control, it couldn't really be evil, could it? It would just be something that hurts us in the moment, but is actually really good. And this begins to tread on the greater good theodicy. And theodicy, since I haven't defined that yet, theodicy is the resolution of the problem of evil. It's an explanation for the existence of God given evil. It's kind of the philosophical term for it. So greater good. Okay. We're a little uncomfortable with God being the cause of sin, but we want to believe that his sovereignty is at work in everything. And also want to figure out how free will comes into play there. Hopefully by this point you can tell we're not going to come to a full and complete resolution of the problem of evil here, but here's some very helpful points to help us think through this problem and maybe develop a way that you can explain it to a friend in the future. Greater good, certainly something you want to include. Genesis 50:20 is probably the clearest description of a greater good from something that was supposed to be bad and evil. This is Joseph. He's abandoned, almost left for dead by his brothers. And he said, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. Is this only supposed to apply to Joseph, or is Joseph pointing out the fate of all things that happen in our lives? Anything that someone has meant for evil. Remember how much evil Pharaoh intended? And yet at this point we look back at it and say, wow, that looks like it's provoked a greater good. And you may think of the New Testament verse that relates to this. It has a little caveat that this greater good specifically relates to those who love and fear God. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. He causes all things to work together. So it starts to detach a little bit from the Calvinistic model. although it could fit under it. But this is also friendly toward a more Arminian model, where God does not specifically intend or ordain for a certain evil to take place, but he can take that thing that took place and use that for something beautiful, cause it to work for good. But it's not going to work for good, this verse would imply. It's not going to work for good for those who are opposed to God. It's going to work for good with those who are close with God. God is the one that can use all apparent bad circumstances in a way that either develops your character or brings him glory. Back to John Piper, he gets to the central issue of what this greater good is. Because I think we have a real problem with thinking of greater good as that which brings us more comfort, makes us happier, more satisfied, more popular, or darn, I got turned down for that job that's $40,000 a year, but after I got turned down for that, I got accepted for a job that's $70,000 a year. Well, that's not the greater good we're talking about. There's a much bigger economy at stake than whether you're living more comfortably. So the greater good may never really be fulfilled on this earth. It may be fulfilled in eternity. Piper says, one way or the other, God sees to it that all things serve to glorify his Son. This is the greater good. That God is glorified in his Son. Not your comfort, but the greatest good is directed toward the greatest being. Here's Piper again, and this combines the gospel with the greater good. God did not just overcome evil at the cross. He made evil serve the overcoming of evil. He made evil commit suicide in doing its worst evil. So in the most evil event, the crucifixion of Jesus, the greatest good accrues, the salvation of mankind through his blood. People are responsible for that evil, I would say. And yet God is able to use that, like Romans 8:28 says, for those who love God and are called according to his purpose, and use that as a great good. For those that never come to that resolution, the death of Jesus is nothing but a tragedy. But to those who are saved, it's life, it's a promise, it's unity with God. And this puts the exclamation point at the end of this greater good idea, that because evil exists, God was able to enter into that evil and overcome that evil. And as we participate in the person of Christ, we, with him, overcome that evil as well. Not just the greater good, but the greatest good. Hey, let me pause right there for now. I think this is going to be a little much to handle all in one session, so we will come back shortly for part 2 on the problem of evil. Hope you'll join me for that, and God bless.